Pattaya City Expats Club is a non-profit social organisation and our speakers are volunteers. The club as such assumes no responsibility or liability for the professional reputation of or the quality of services provided by the speaker today.
And the other club.
Thank you, Ren. Yes, Simon Carey is here, and as he said, we had him as a guest a few weeks ago at the other club, and I was reading through his promo, and it said that he was going to be talking about the Russian Revolution and the connection with Pattaya, and of course, immediately you think, well, what is their connection? What could their connection possibly be? And of course, he's going to explain that to you in great detail. It was one of the most fascinating talks that we've had, I have to say. And without more ado, I'm not going to spoil any of it, and I can't remember the details myself. Please put your hands together for Simon. Whichever one, this one's working. There we are, sir.
Yes, thank you very much for hosting me today. It's a wonderful opportunity. I'm a past Pattaya resident for many, many years. These days, post-COVID, we do share our time more between Australia and Thailand. But we're up here for another 10 days and back to Australia, then back up here again. My wife said to me over breakfast this morning, she said, well, look, I know it's a very serious topic about what you're going to talk about, but you need to make it a little bit lighter. Well, it's hard to talk about Russian history and joviality at the same time. I mean, they started out with Ivan the Terrible, and I think things got worse since then. You know, one Russian poet wrote once that Russia is a country of masters and slaves. Well, when he wrote that, he was referring to the Tsars and the aristocracy, and today you have Putin and the oligarchs, so nothing really much has ever changed in Russia. So what is it about Pattaya and the Russian Revolution, and why is a Australian stroke New Zealander standing up here and talking to you about this? As Brian mentioned, and I hope I'm going to push the right button, I have written the first of 4 books about this subject. Why? Well, this is the reason why. Now, one of the people here is my wife. She's on this side. Some people might know Bronwyn from Women with a Mission, the charity that's been running here in Thailand for more than 20 years, I think. The other person in there is Arlette Sykman. Her maiden name, if I could, or her family name was Sukov. So she had Russian heritage. Arlette was very big in PILC, which you'll all know, and she ran the PILC Christmas Bazaar, and she ran the big black tie ball that PILC used to run every year. And so she raised all the money, and Bronwyn spent it. So they had a very close relationship through that, the charities that were running here. And because I used to do a bit of writing for them, somebody said one day to Arlette, well, before you die, possibly not using those words, but you have to put your story down on paper, and I was the anointed one, whether I liked it or not. And that's why I came to write the story. So I said, well, where did it all start? And there was this place called Pattaya. I said, well, where on earth is Pattaya? Well, the cross-hatched lines there, that's the, of course, most people will recognise that as the Trans-Siberian Railway that runs basically from the the western coast through to the Pacific Ocean. It's a huge railway, the longest in the world. Pattaya is there about halfway along, and it's in Siberia. If you know the city of Novosibirsk, it's hard to say that without spitting at everybody. It's a side railway line that runs through to Turkmenistan. Those days it was called Turkestan. So that's where this family originated from. So after many months of me sitting down interviewing Arlette, she is now unfortunately dead. She died in 2021. We used to sit there together every 2 weeks. She was a great diarist. She had a huge amount of information and files on the family history, newspaper cuttings, photograph albums, memorabilia, everything. It was a sort of an author's heaven in a way to have all this information literally dumped in my lap. But there were gaps in the story that we worked out quite quickly that we needed to get into Russia ourselves to find that out. And getting into Russia, even though the Iron Curtain had fallen at that stage, is not the easiest thing to do in the world. And the last thing you want to tell them when you're in there researching a book, because immediately you would come under the spotlight of the police. However, we did manage to make contact with the university in Pattaya, their hometown, and we said, well, we want to come in and we'd learn a bit about the Sukov family. And they said, well, you don't mean the Sukov family, do you? And they said, well, they're famous. And we've got oceans of information available to us. And strangely enough, in Russia, and the guy on the left-hand side up there is the Dean of History of Pattaya University, and that's his lovely assistant, Maria. And they did work with us very, very closely and provided some fantastic information to fill in the gaps. The other guy there in the blue parka is a friend and ex-work colleague of mine who volunteered as my research assistant. In this type of writing, you can't have enough research. You just keep, even today we're still researching for the other books. So we spent in total a month in Russia, travelling from St. Petersburg on the Baltic coast and right through on the Trans-Siberian through to Vladivostok, which is on the Pacific Ocean. If you did it, what I call cold turkey, in other words, you just sat on the train and went straight through, it's a 9-day, 9-night journey, non-stop. Of course, we got off along the way. We certainly spent quite a bit of time in Pattaya and in Lake Baikal, the biggest freshwater lake in the world, and Kirkst, and I could name many, many places that form not only part of the history of Russia and the revolution and the Civil War, but also we followed the escape route out of the Sukov family, step by step, and that was fascinating. So we're standing there at the end of the journey in Vladivostok. I don't know if you can see the number on that says something like 9,288 kilometres. Now that's not from St. Petersburg, that's from Moscow to Vladivostok. That's an awfully long train line. But we did make it to Vladivostok, and we did manage to get out of the country without ending up in jail, which is good. So the story starts in 1917. We discussed how far we could take it back, because obviously when you're dealing with a family history, you could almost go back forever to the creation. But we decided 1917 was really the pivotal year. What was happening in Russia at that time? Well, you can see there that World War I just happened to be happening at that time, and a lot of people don't realise it, but the Western Allies, that's people like France and Great Britain, and to the end America, were fighting on the Western Front. There was another front, which was the Russians were also fighting against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so that war was going on. They had, at that stage, they'd managed to finally sideline the Tsar, who was just a meddler in Russian politics and in the war itself, and they'd forced him to abdicate. They hadn't killed him at that stage, he was still there. But Russia wasn't in a very good place at that time. There was a lot of food shortages, a lot of starvation, and particularly in the big cities of St. Petersburg at that stage was known as Petrograd. They keep changing the names to confuse everybody, and of course Moscow was still Moscow, but there were food queues and riots, and in the background the Bolsheviks, which is Lenin and his cohorts, were stirring up trouble. Lenin was actually in exile at that stage in Switzerland, but they were promoting what they call peace, land and bread. Now, peace, but it was that the Bolsheviks were saying Russia should pull out of the war against Germany. Of course, the Allies didn't like that concept at all, and that's why they tried to stop the Bolsheviks. But certainly the Bolsheviks were getting into the unions in the big cities, particularly of Petrograd and Moscow. They were also stirring up a lot of trouble in the army. So there were strikes and demonstrations in the cities, and the army was starting to mutiny and desert in very large numbers. So it was a pretty tough time. Of course, most people realise that, or think about the Russian Revolution in terms of the storming of the Winter Palace in October 1917. This was a lot of Bolshevik propaganda. They did storm the palace. There was nothing very much to storm. There was no real defences there. So it was symbolic rather than strategic. But the Bolsheviks at that stage were just a minority political party in Russia. Didn't have very much support. Certainly outside of the two main cities, amongst the peasants, they didn't have any support at all. So they decided that they had a right to rule, and if they couldn't gain that through the ballot box, the easiest way would be just to have a revolution and take over anyway, which is exactly what Lenin and co orchestrated, and managed to do that. So you've got the Sukhov family sitting out in the middle of Siberia, southern Siberia actually, and this is a photograph, the actual wedding photograph of Pavel and Maria Sukhov. So that was Arlet's great-great-grandfather and grandmother. And they were merchants in Siberia. They owned a couple of stores in Barnaul. They had a tannery, they had a candle-making factory, they had a horse stud farm outside. So they were middle-class, wealthy people. They certainly were not aristocrats. And of course, they were sitting there, and the Bolsheviks were threatening to take everything they owned away from them. And so they had this horrible choice to make, that they either fought against the Bolsheviks or they packed up and fled. And they decided that they were going to stay and fight. So there's the family tree. I won't go through it very much. It's quite complicated. But there's Pavel and Maria there. They had a daughter called Ia, who was married to Mikhail, who gave birth to Vera, who is Arlet's mother. So Arlet's mother was actually born in Siberia in the middle of the Russian Civil War. And that's the other thing too that most people don't realise in the history books, is that the people think that the Russian Revolution started and ended in October when the Winter Palace was stormed. It didn't. That was the start of it. It certainly wasn't the end. A civil war erupted between the Bolshevik stroke communists and everybody else who was opposed to them. And it went on for 4 long years and killed many, many people. And for that reason alone, they decided, the ultimate victors decided to wipe out the Civil War from their history books. So even though it killed something like 250,000 people, it didn't really happen at all. One of the other things happened in 1917, and this is in Pattaya. The Siberian towns that were tended to be constructed mostly of timber, and they all had open fireplaces, and that's something which was going to end up in disaster every now and again. And certainly the Pattaya fire of May 1917 was one of the great fire disasters that happened. It's quite a large town. Back then there was 70,000 people population. 60% of the town burnt down. And that's significant not just for the fact that there was a disaster, but it sort of created a bit of a political vacuum, because nobody had, the Russian government, or nobody had any money to go and spend in terms of reconstruction of the town. So in the aftermath of the fire, the Bolsheviks sort of filled the vacuum politically and took over the town and created their own civilian militias who started to create a lot of problems for people like store owners and property owners. So the Sukhovs hung on and hung on, and it was becoming untenable living in the town, and at the end of the day, a lot of the population had to pack up and go. And of course, the roads in Siberia are terrible. The weather isn't the best weather in the world, and one of the big issues there was not just death through fighting or starvation. Typhoid was absolutely rampant and spread through lice. So they decided that they couldn't hang on, and they fled. One of the other odd things about the Russian Civil War is the Czech-Slovak Legion. The Czech-Slovaks were actually fighting for the Austro-Hungarian army, but they really wanted to fight the Habsburgs, the army, because they wanted to create Czechoslovakia an independent state. And so they swapped sides to the Russian side, and then Russia pulled out of the war after the Bolsheviks took over. This is World War I. And so they found themselves stuck, this huge army, about 80,000 people, men in Siberia. And all they did was wanted to get out. There's only one way out for them, and that was on the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Bolsheviks decided that they were going to make problems for them to try to get out, and those guys said, well, we'll fight you. And to a certain degree, the start of the Russian Civil War against the Bolsheviks was created by these guys, and then all the other anti-Bolshevik forces grouped around the Czechoslovaks and started to fight them up and down the whole Trans-Siberian Railway. This is where book one, this ends, is that they decided, they being the Czechoslovaks and the British, decided that Pattaya was strategic and they wanted to retake it. I needed to add there that the other untold story that most of you will be unaware of is that a lot of our own countries went in and fought in the Civil War in Russia. Certainly the French were there, certainly the British were there, the Canadians were there, the Italians were there, the Americans were there, and strange but true, the Japanese were there. The Japanese were very much running their own agenda, which somebody should have sat down and thought about that. They were more interested in securing chunks of China like Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula from a strategic and geographical point of view, and that sort of was portend to what they happened, to Pearl Harbor in the end. But they were there in force. But in any case, the Battle of Banayal took place in June 1918. It was one of the big set-piece battles in the Russian Civil War. And they beat the Bolsheviks, and they claimed back that area of Siberia. It was a bit unusual, and as Maria Sukov said, well, we're sitting here on an island of white surrounded by a sea of red. I mean, their problem was really that they beat the Bolsheviks, but they didn't destroy them. The Bolsheviks, at the end of the day, went back into the forests and formed partisan groups, and then ended up creating problems that further down the track. And that's where Book 1 finishes at the end of the Battle of Banayal. And there are going to be, of course, other books, but the other great thing that happened after the battle, of course, was that Germany and the Western Allies, they signed the armistice in November, which basically meant that World War I had ended, and a lot of the reason for the West to support the anti-Bolshevik forces to try to get Russia back into the war, that reason sort of went away. I keep using the expression that the Allies in there, and particularly the Americans, that they hadn't really figured out why they were there or what their objectives were going to be. But one of the reasons why they weren't that keen themselves to get involved, and you can understand that the British particularly had lost huge amounts of men across on the Western Front. A lot of those countries were tired of war and couldn't see the reason why they should be participating in a civil war in another country. And politically, within Britain, the British trade union movement was saying, well, why are you fighting the Bolsheviks? They are our comrades, our brothers in arms. So the politics was starting to work against the anti-Bolshevik forces, yet they were winning. And they had pushed the communists into a bubble, which was represented by that red curve. There were three major thrusts, one coming down from Archangel and Murmansk in the north, and that was mostly what we call White Russian forces, the anti-communist forces, and the British, and some Canadians. And the Siberian army was comprised again of Russians, of the Czech-Slovak Legion, and coming up through the Caspian and Crimea was another force which was mostly Cossacks supported by British. And the other thing that was happening is that the Western Allies had created a blockade, a shipping blockade, so really the bubble was sort of starting to collapse and compress. And everybody said, well, it's only a matter of days or weeks before this whole Bolshevik thing just falls over. The major guy in the West, strangely enough, pushing the Allies' involvement was a guy called Winston Churchill, who was very keen on military adventures, and he thought that there's only one good communist, which is a dead communist, and the best way to deal with them is strangle them at birth. That was his own words, and maybe he should have been allowed to succeed. Who knows? But there was one man standing in their road. This is a photograph of Leon Trotsky. Now, if you go to Russia today and you try to find anything about Leon Trotsky, well, you won't, because he's another person that's got wiped out of the history books. He was a guy who created the Red Army. He was a guy who made sure that they were fed and they were clothed and they had vodka, and he literally pushed them into battle, and he created out of a rabble a very strong, disciplined army. And one of the things which I didn't explain in the previous slide was that, in military strategy, as a bubble collapses, you can in fact get stronger because your lines of communication are a lot shorter. On the other side of the equation, all those supply lines running out of Vladivostok or Crimea were overextended. And so when this guy organised the counter-offensive, when the counter-punch came, it staggered the White Armies on all three fronts, and an orderly retreat soon became a total rout. And in Siberia, what's known as the Ice March started, where people, their only way out was to try to get out to Vladivostok. Now, that was thousands of kilometres away, and the train lines were blocked. Walking was an option, and a lot of them tried to get out that way. Huge amounts of people died. Nobody will really ever know the numbers, and they didn't keep records, and nobody wants to know any case. But as I mentioned, a figure probably conservatively around about 250,000 people died. So the Bolsheviks gradually worked their way towards the Pacific Ocean from Moscow and St. Petersburg, and so everybody retreated, including the Sukhov family, made it back to Vladivostok, because at that stage there was no use staying and fighting anymore. They just had to get out. They hung on there. Vladivostok hung on until 22. Most of the fighting was over in 1920. But the Reds were at the gate. The Navy was mutinying. An admiral collected together the remnants of the aged Russian Pacific Fleet, loaded everybody on board, and they didn't have any option. They sailed straight out into the Sea of Japan into a typhoon. 3 major vessels were sunk, 3,000 people died or disappeared. They managed to make it to the Korean Peninsula, stayed there for a while, and then sailed up the Yangtze to what's known as the International Concession. Now, they parked their ships in the Yangtze. The International Concession, some of you might know, if you've been to Shanghai, was carved out of the Opium Wars. Was not technically part of China, but was owned and run by Americans and British and French. And all of a sudden they had thousands of Russians, refugees, turn up on their doorstep, all armed to the teeth. Weren't that keen about letting them off, but in the end they didn't have any option. So the Russians stayed there and formed what became quite a large community within what we call Shanghai today. And that's a photograph of the Bund. Obviously, the Russians, when they arrived there, once the women had sold their mink stoles and their jewellery, everybody was running out of money. They didn't have any work. It was a terrible situation for most of the Russian refugees. A lot of the men ended up in opium dens. They became security guards. They formed small private military armies. They joined them as mercenaries. The woman reverted back to the age-old employment of the oldest profession in the world. To survive, 25% of Russian women became prostitutes there just to make ends meet. It was very, very tough. What happened to the Sukov family? Well, not all of them made it out. This is one of the daughters, Galina, who at the 11th hour said, "I'm not going to try to get out to Vladivostok or to Shanghai. I'm going to stay here and fight." And she joined a white partisan brigade and to fight the communists, which was still a lot of fighting went on for many, many years. We think she survived and had a daughter, but it's a little bit obscure. Ia, who was mother of Vera, that was Arlette's daughter, she lost her husband along the way, and then tragically she made it to Shanghai, and then she took her own life. Mara, one of the daughters, married a Canadian. She bought herself a ticket out of town and ended up living in Canada. Dmitry, the young son, joined in the international concession, there was a big volunteer Russian regiment to police the borders of the concession to try to keep the Chinese out and the Chinese communists out. Maria, she managed to survive, the mother, and Pavel managed to get himself a job with what we know as the HSBC as security. There, they were building that when he arrived, and he managed to use his connections to get a job. So Vera Sukov, which is Arlette's mother, was brought up because her mother had died. She was brought up by Maria, the grandparent. Went to a French convent in there, and then, like many people do when they're very poor, they tend to marry off their daughters to try to get themselves out of poverty, and they married her off to Leon, who was a part Egyptian, part Armenian, running a type of sports gambling complex in Shanghai. And gambling meant there were girls, there were drugs, the usual combination in there, and that marriage didn't last. But they did have, in 1937, when Paul was born. And of course the other thing that happened in Shanghai at that time in 1937 is the Japanese came and decided to take over and occupy Shanghai. A lot of people, you might have read Empire of the Sun growing up. Many Westerners were interned, if you're British or American particularly. They tended to leave the Russians alone because they weren't sort of fighting them at that stage. But things went from bad to worse again during the occupation. So during that occupation, Arlette was born here, Pavel died, and then, as I mentioned, Vera decided, even though she was strict Catholic, well, not Roman Catholic, but certainly Russian Orthodox Catholic, that divorce is effectively forbidden except for one criteria, and that's adultery. So she decided that enough was enough, and she got out of that marriage. Of course, it's a bit hard to see, but all of a sudden in 1945, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the war ended in an instant, and the Japanese who were occupying Shanghai just basically laid down their arms. So what happened after that to the family? Well, all of a sudden, this guy turns up called Louis Seichmann. You might have seen Arlette's name was Arlette Sukov Seichmann. So this became her stepfather. An American Polish Jew who was military intelligence in World War II, located in this area around here, capturing and interrogating Japanese prisoners of war, particularly the Japanese officers. He decided he was going to go to Shanghai for a holiday and to check it out. Well, maybe. We think he had other agendas. And of course, following the Japanese surrender, hostilities resumed between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong. And ultimately, of course, the communists prevailed, and they weren't any friends of the Russians, refugees there, because they were all anti-communist. And therefore, there was no option that they had to get out. The Sukov family pleaded with Louis Seichmann because I should add that Vera and Louis started up a romantic relationship between them there, and they pleaded for Louis to get them out to the States. Louis claimed that he couldn't get them to the US because of problems with Maria, the grandmother's paperwork, and he said, I've got a better idea, let's go to Thailand. 1950 turned up at Dong Muang Airport. Of course, Savannah-Boom didn't exist in those days. There was no real immigration, customs, anything. They were driven straight through the gates and out into Bangkok. The other thing that happened during the war is, during World War I, America didn't really have a secret service. During World War II, the British and the French, of course, had spies everywhere, and yeah, they had a history of spying. Americans who were basically isolationists up to then had not had that same sort of network. But in World War II, they created the OSS, which, following the war, morphed into the CIA. Now, why is that significant? Well, the Sukov family and Louis Seichmann descended into Bangkok. Louis had conveniently arranged that he had an anti-communist wife, and he had to have a cover, and so they decided to set up Dairy Burl Ice Cream, the first ice cream manufacturer in Bangkok. But there were some others hanging around. Jim Thompson, during the war, was OSS. Following the war, became CIA. And he was the silk industry, or recreated, so-called, the silk industry here in Thailand. Nice cover, Jim. And then there was another guy who turned up called Robert North. He was a movie director, but he was a major undercover CIA agent here in Thailand. And another guy came into Thailand, appointed ambassador, US ambassador, Wild Bill Donovan, as he was known. He was the creator of the OSS, now the CIA. Many of you might have visited Jim Thompson's house in Bangkok, the house on the Klong. This is the meeting place for what I call the Band of Brothers, that group of people who came out of World War II as OSS or military intelligence, whatever, and they formed this group. And there was another guy there who was starting up a fledgling airline called Air America, which was ultimately CIA's airline. And they sat around up there in alcohol-fueled dinner parties on the Klong in Bangkok. And they ran what was then the secret operation here in Thailand, the secret wars that were happening not just in Laos, not just in Vietnam or Cambodia, but also in northern Thailand itself against the Thai Communist Party, which nobody wants to talk about these days. So the US State Department at that stage their policy was all around what was called the domino theory, which meant that northern Thailand and this part of the world was going to be the front line in the fight against communism. Because if Russia had fallen, China had fallen to communism, North Vietnam was communist, and if we don't stop them here, what happens next, and the domino theory prevailed in Washington. Whoops, I'll just go back to that one. The other thing, of course, was the McCarthy in the US, McCarthyism, which was the great anti-communist push within America, so that really supported this domino theory as well. And there was a bit of an issue with that because Jim Thompson and Louis Seichmann and we used to go into forays into North Vietnam to meet the leaders there and have discussions. This was before the war was actually officially started. And Jim Thompson in particular was quite adamant that the America policy was wrong. They were backing the wrong bunch. They were backing a bunch of, in Southeast Asia, of bad generals who were just in there to make money. And he wasn't just talking about South Vietnam, he was talking about Thailand as well, amongst others. So he became more and more vocal about that and more unpopular, not just with the State Department, but also the Thai generals weren't that keen to have somebody here pushing back against them because they were making too much money, frankly, out of the whole situation. The place, Bangkok, was being flooded with spies and CIA money. It was so, and there was a lot going on. Meantime, the girls, which is Vera Seichmann and Maxine, who was married to Robert North, the undercover CIA guy, they weren't exactly sitting on their hands. So they created, Vera created the Star of Siam, which was to take the silk fabric that was made either by Louis in his or by Jim Thompson, and to make haute couture clothing and sell them, and they were clothing Queen Sirikit, the palace, and all of a sudden the whole silk fashion industry sort of really took off there. They decided to do their own silkworm propagation up in Surin, and like Jim, they put in a silk weaving place in Bangkok. Maxine North, on the other hand, created the first fresh water, bottled water for Thailand, which was known as Polaris water. In the old days, when you used to ask for water, you used to ask for Polaris. That was okay until some of the big liquor companies like Singer realised that a Farang was stealing their thunder and doing something which was rightly theirs, and then started creating problems for her. Maxine also rejuvenated what's known as Celadon pottery, that green ceramic pottery here, which is of course in Thailand you can't get away from the generals. This particular character is called Field Marshal Sirit, who came in and effectively ruled the place following World War II. He was instrumental in bringing 2 young Thai princes and their mother back from Switzerland and recreating the Thai monarchy. And he ruled this country with an iron fist. But one day, Sirit, more importantly his wife, walked in to the Star of Siam, which is their fashion business, and said, "We want 50% of the business." And there wasn't anything you could do to stop that. And they effectively, at the end of the day, they destroyed it. So this is the connection, and I've sort of gone through this quite quickly. What you've seen in this few minutes is a span of all the books. So the first 2 books will be about Russia and their escape from Russia, and then there's their time in Shanghai and the international concession, followed at the end of the day by their time in Thailand. And honestly, the time in Thailand is just as interesting as all the other stuff. It's the early history of the expatriates in Thailand is quite complicated. But one by one, what I call the Cold War warriors started to fall. And here today, strangely enough, while they used to live in Bangkok, Pattaya was their playground, weekend playground at that stage, even though the drive time down there was about 5.5 hours in those days. And when they got old and retired or closed their businesses, they moved down here and lived here in Pattaya. So that's Maria Sukov, the great-great-grandmother. There is a family plot for the Sukovs, and it's in St. Nicholas Church on Sukhumvit Road. And there are a lot of them there. So there's Maria. Paul Sukov's there, Vera Sukov's there, Dmitry Sukov's there, Mary Sukov, which was wife of Dmitry, is there, and Louis Seichmann is there. Robert North and Maxine North are buried there. You might, some of you might know the North Star Library here in Pattaya, up on Sukhumvit Road. North Star was a legacy created from Maxine and Vera, and it's still there today. Strangely enough, the one person who's missing out of that plot at St. Nicholas Church is Jim Thompson, as many of you know, mysteriously disappeared in the Malaysian jungles. In 1967, his body has never been found somewhere in an unmarked grave. So what I'm talking about here is, I explained, is that the span of the book. It does cover 2 world wars, 2 civil wars, and notwithstanding the local war here, which ended up as the Vietnam War. So there's a lot of history, a lot of interesting background, and I thank you for your time today, and hope you perhaps enjoyed it, or perhaps even learned something. But thank you.
Questions? Hang on.
Maybe I didn't listen well, but
Hang on.
Okay. Yes? Maybe I didn't listen well, but you said 2 civil wars. Which is the second?
The Chinese Civil War. They lived through the Chinese Civil War and the Russian Civil War.
Yes, when I came here in August 1967, the Polaris water was the only good water you could get in Pattaya. And the problem is that local shops, when the bottle was empty, they would just fill it from the faucet. And you have no idea what happened to our internal digestive systems.
Well, I think probably most of us do, which is.
But it was pretty bad. By the way, I did know about the Russian presence here, and I know people that knew them personally that still live here. And there's several theories on Jim Thompson's disappearance. There were other people in the silk business in Bangkok that weren't foreigners but Chinese.
Yes, that is correct.
And some of them are in the news every day today.
You're possibly talking about the Shinawat family.
I didn't say that, you did. And Thaksin had nothing to do with it for sure because he was a teenager, but his father had a lot of pull at that time. But anyway, there's a lot of stories. I've met people, a number of people I knew very, very well many years ago that came from Shanghai that knew these people, knew them in Shanghai, and then came here and started businesses in 1949. And they had stories to tell about Thailand and Shanghai, by the way, in those days that were unbelievable. It was fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, thanks for the comments. And, I just want to add that even though Jim Thompson was part of the group, this book isn't about Jim Thompson, it's about the Sukoff family. And I think what you've alluded to as well is that any general open discussion about the possible disappearance of Jim Thompson can in itself be quite a dangerous subject here, and it's one to be avoided publicly.
Hi. Very interesting talk you've just given. If you've already covered this subject, I apologise because it's very difficult to hear everything. Was there any truth in the fact that the British royal family, particularly King Edward, was going to send a ship to pick up the Russian Tsar and his family? And did the then present government stop it because they were concerned that communism was riding in Great Britain?
Well, I can answer it. It was actually King George at that time. The strange thing was that the Tsar Nicholas II and King George were cousins, but so was Wilhelm in Germany and Franz Joseph in Austria. There were 4 cousins there, and there was a proposal that when the Tsar abdicated and the Tsar and his family was getting into dangerous territory, that they were going to go into exile in Britain. The then Prime Minister, Lloyd George, was persuaded not to allow them in because the trade unions in Britain would be very much against having a Russian aristocratic family descend on them and having to support them, particularly since they were the wrong side of politics, and therefore Lloyd George decided to convince King George not to allow that to happen. And I think we all know, it took many, many years for them for us to find out that Tsar Nicholas and his whole family were in fact assassinated secretly.
Just like a bit more detail on the Bolsheviks and who they were and how they became so powerful, considering that there was no social media in those days to spread their philosophies.
Yeah, well, there were many forms of communism, number one, and the Bolsheviks weren't the only, if I could use the term, Marxist communist or socialist party in Russia. There were the Bolsheviks and there were the Mensheviks. There was the Socialist Republicans, and there was a raft of other small parties. The problem for the left-hand side of the politics was that because there were a lot of different parties with slightly different creeds, it was split. The vote was always split, so no one party could gain the majority. And Lenin said, my view is that we are the only ones with the right philosophy. We should prevail. Let's not wait to try to win through the ballot box. Let's just go out and seize power. And to a certain degree, and if you read the book, you'll understand how they seized power. They filled a political vacuum within Russia, and there wasn't a lot of big pushback.
I should imagine, though, that they're challenging the powers that be, and how in that era would they spread their word?
Well, they had what they call political cadres that used to go around, and they turned the army, which was the pivotal thing,